The Middle East is on fire. The United States of America warplanes are roaring over the skies of the Middle East. Israel is striking Iran with military precision that the world has not seen before. Iran too has responded in a manner that the world never anticipated. The result is millions of citizens running for safety, ports going up in flames, and cities reduced to mere rubble. For decades, this rivalry between the United States of America and Iran has unfolded in the name of economic sanctions, covert operations, and military proxies. But this conflict did not start overnight. Once upon a time, the Iran and the United States of America were close allies. During the Cold War, the two countries stood together and shielded the Middle Eastern from the chaos of Cold War. But now, that is not the case. The once upon a time good friends are now locked in a conflict that threatens the peace of the world, the economy of the world, and the future of the Middle East. So how did these two good allies degenerate into a conflict that now threatens the entire region? In the aftermath of the Second World War, Iran stood at the crossroads. To the north was the powerful Soviet Union, the United States of America's main rival during the Cold War. To the south was the Persian Gulf, home to some of the world's largest oil reserves. And in between stood Iran. And therefore, whoever managed to tilt Iran to its position would win the balance of power as far as the politics of the Middle East are concerned. At that time, Iran was ruled by Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, also known as the Shah. The young monarch believed that Iran needed rapid modernization. He envisioned a country that would transform from a traditional society into a powerful modern state. But Iran's political system was fragile. Nationalists, religious leaders, communists, and royalists all competed for influence. At the center of their struggle was the powerful resource that is the oil. Since the early 20th century, most of Iran's petroleum industry had been controlled by the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which was later branded as BP. The company generated enormous profits for Britain. But many Iranians believed that this arrangement was deeply unfair. This is because Iran received only a fraction of the wealth that was generated by its own resources. By the late 1940s, anger towards foreign control of Iranian oil was spreading fast across the country, and soon a nationalist leader would turn that anger into a political movement. In 1951, the Iranian parliament made a decision that shocked the West. The Iranian parliament elected Mohammad Mossadegh as its prime minister. Mossadegh was a nationalist hero who believed that Iran should control its natural resources for the benefit of its people. Within months, Mossadegh nationalized the Iran oil, and this means the British control over the Iranian oil came to an end overnight. Inside Iran, Mossadegh was celebrated as a national hero, but in Britain, Mossadegh was condemned. He steered an economic fury from Britain and worsened the relations between Iran and the West. Within months, Britain responded with economic blockade. And this means that Iran oil exports collapsed and its economy was on a free fall. At first, the United States of America, under the presidency of Harry Truman, tried to mediate this conflict in a diplomatic manner. This is because the geopolitical context did not allow the US to use force. This is because the Cold War was at the peak, and there was a thinking within the US that if the US uses force, then the Tudor party in Iran would come to power, and that is likely to push the Iran into the Soviet influence. And because of that fear, the US settled on diplomacy as opposed to the use of force. But this did not last for long. When President Eisenhower came to office in 1953, Washington adopted a far more aggressive strategy. The United States of America settled on direct intervention as opposed to mediation. In August 1953, America and Britain launched a covert plan known as Operation Ajax. This operation had a very simple objective: remove Mossadegh from power and strengthen the authority of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and in so doing, strengthen the Western control over the natural resources of Iran, and in particular oil. This operation was coordinated by the Central Intelligence Agency and Britain's M16. Through propaganda campaigns, political manipulation, bribery, and carefully orchestrated protests, this operation succeeded in destabilizing the Mossadegh regime. Between August 15 and August 19, in 1953, Tehran descended into chaos. Demonstrations filled the streets, and as planned, the Mossadegh government collapsed. He was arrested, placed on a solitary confinement, and later placed under strict house arrest. On 5th March 1967, at the age of 84 years, Mossadegh died. But his ideals on Iranian nationalism, democracy, and resistance to foreign control lived on. After the hosting of Mossadegh, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, also known as the Shah, came back to power. Upon returning to power, he was strongly backed by the United States of America. For Washington, this was a triumph, and it meant that they had managed to restore their relations between Iran and themselves, and therefore securing a strategic partner during the Cold War. But inside Iran, this event left a deep and a lasting wound. With the American support, the Shah launched ambitious program of modernizing Iran, also known as the White Revolution, in 1963. These reforms were sweeping. Land reforms broke up large estates, women gained the right to vote, education expanded rapidly, and industrial projects transformed cities across Iran. To Western observers, Iran appeared to be transforming into a modern pro-Western power. But modernization came with a very expensive cost. Rapid change disrupted traditional society, and economic inequality became the order of the day. Political dissent was ruthlessly suppressed, and the Shah relied heavily on the feared intelligence service known as the SAVAK. SAVAK was created and trained by CIA. SAVAK monitored political opponents, censored media, and imprisoned those who opposed the rule of the Shah. Among the Shah's fiercest critic was Ruhollah Khomeini, a cleric who would become one of the most influential revolutionary figures in the modern history of Iran. Khomeini condemned the Shah's reform and denounced what he viewed as a growing American influence within Iran. In 1964, Khomeini was exiled from Iran. But this exile did not silence him. From Iraq and later France, Khomeini continued delivering sermons that were circulated secretly inside Iran. By the late 1970s, economic frustrations and political repressions reached the peak in Iran. Coupled with religious opposition, a powerful revolutionary movement ensued. At first, Shah regimes appeared stable, but beneath the surface, it was already beginning to collapse. In 1978, the demonstrations erupted across Iran. These demonstrations spread from religious centers across the leading cities in Iran and leading public universities. Workers too launched massive strikes. These strikes stalled the Iran economy. Millions of people poured into the streets demanding the end of the monarch. At the initial stages, the Shah regime tried to suppress these protests. However, in 1979, the unimaginable thing happened, and it changed the course of the modern-day Iran history. The Shah fled Iran, and weeks later, Ruhollah Khomeini returned from France to Tehran after 14 years in exile. The scenes were extraordinary. Millions gathered to welcome him, and soon after, the monarch collapsed. Iran was transformed from a secular state to an Islamic Republic of Iran. This revolution did not just change the Iran's political system, it transformed the country's relations with the United States of America. To revolutionary leaders, Washington symbolized decades of foreign control and influence and support for the infamous Shah rule. This revolution did not end there. It raged on. In 1979, The Iranian revolutionary students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran. They captured 52 American diplomats, and this crisis stunned the world. For 444 days, the hostages remained in captivity. Inside Iran, the embassy takeover strengthened radical factions that opposed reconciliation with the United States of America. Inside America, this crisis dominated political discussions. President Jimmy Carter attempted diplomacy and eventually authorized rescue operation known as Operation Eagle Claw. But this mission ended in disaster when helicopters crashed in the Iranian desert. 8 American servicemen lost their lives. The hostages were finally released in January 1981. But by then, diplomatic relations between the United States of America and Iran had completely collapsed. Soon after the revolution, Iran faced another devastating moment. In September 1980, Iraq leader Saddam Hussein attacked Iran. He launched the brutal Iran-Iraq War, which lasted for 8 years. In this war, thousands of people lost their lives. The United States of America, concerned about Iran's revolutionary ideology spreading across the region, tilted and supported Iraq. Meanwhile, Iran began developing a strategy that would later shape the Middle East relations. Iran, instead of relying solely on its conventional military power, it resorted to cultivating networks with allied armed groups. In Lebanon, the militant organization Hezbollah emerged with Iranian backing. Over time, Iran built relationships with armed factions across Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. This strategy allowed Iran to project influence across the region without direct confrontation with the United States. In the early 2000s, tension intensified once again. Iran's nuclear program became the center of global concern. Iran started enriching uranium with an objective that the West described as an end goal of producing nuclear weapons. The Western governments feared that Iran might end up developing the nuclear weapons. Inside Iran also, politics was shifting. Reformist President Mohammad Khatami attempted to improve relations with the West. Later, President Hassan Rouhani pursued negotiations with the Western powers. These talks eventually produced a comprehensive plan of action in 2015. Under this agreement, Iran limited its nuclear ambitions. And in exchange, the United States of America lifted the economic sanctions that had crippled the Iran economy. For a brief moment, the tension between the United States of America and Iran appeared to ease. In the election of 2016, Donald Trump was elected president of the United States of America. In January 2017, Donald Trump was sworn in as the 45th President of the United States of America. In 2018, Donald Trump withdrew from the agreement and reinstated economic sanctions on Iran. And this means that once again, the relations between the United States of America and Iran worsened. In January 2020, the United States of America, in the wee hours of the morning, launched a drone attack from its military base in Iraq. This drone attack claimed the life of Qasem Soleimani. Qasem Soleimani was the architect of Iran's regional strategy and one of the most powerful figures in the Middle East. The shock is immediate but calculated. Days later, Iran launches ballistic missile attacks against the US bases in Iraq and Syria. This signals that Iran is ready to retaliate, but not ready to engage in a full-scale military encounter. Days later, this confrontation comes to an end, and that end means that the world again is averted from a full-blown conflict between Iran and the United States of America. Yet beneath this brief pause, something fundamental shifted. That this is no longer a shadow conflict fought through proxies and covert operations. That in this conflict, the red line had been crossed, and for the first time, the two enemies were engaged in a military confrontation that is largely described as direct. And from this moment forward, the path to confrontation became far more direct and far more dangerous. After the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the tension between the United States of America and Iran was on a constant increase. However, this tension did not explode. In the years that followed, the United States of America went back to its earlier strategy, and that is continued pressure and economic sanctions on Iran. And therefore, in this strategy, the United States of America tightened sanctions against Iran, which were meant to isolate Iran and eventually cripple its economy. Oil revenues shrank and inflation in Iran continued to rise, and access to global financial systems became increasingly difficult for Iran. Inside Iran, something was also shifting. After the deal that made Iran drop its military ambitions was quashed by the United States of America, Iran went back also to its factory settings. And this means that the uranium enrichment expanded and the Iran advanced its nuclear ambitions. Therefore, the nuclear limits that once defined restraint began to erode, and piece by piece they eroded. Mistrust had already disappeared between Iran and the United States of America. The ensuing relations were extremely fragile. By the time the world reached in 2024, the rivalry was no longer defined by diplomacy with moments of tension, but instead it was defined by tension with only fleeting moments of diplomacy. Both sides are no longer trying to rebuild the past. They are preparing for what may come next. Early in 2025, a final window of diplomacy opens, and negotiations begin in Oman and in leading European capitals. These negotiations are carried out by intermediaries, and carefully worded proposals are presented. The objective of these talks is very simple: that Iran drops its nuclear ambitions, and in return, the United States of America lifts the economic sanctions that had frustrated and crippled the Iran economy. However, because of the existing mistrust, these talks are approached by each party in a careful manner. And this careful manner means that each party is keen to secure a deal that advances its interest. And therefore, Iran demands that the United States of America gives them a guarantee that in future, any incoming United States of America administration does not have an opportunity to withdraw from the deal. This is to curb its earlier experience of 2018, in which Donald Trump came and withdrew from a deal that was signed in 2015 under the Barack Obama presidency. And therefore, Washington is constrained by its own system and therefore cannot make this promise. And without trust, even the smallest compromise becomes impossible. Weeks turn into months and progress stalls. Then, without ceremony or resolution, these talks collapsed. The collapse of these talks is not just a monumental failure, but a final window of diplomacy closing as far as these encounters and engagements are concerned. And therefore, a confirmation that, at least for now, diplomacy had run its course. In the mid-2025, this conflict takes a decisive turn. The United States of America launches military attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. And therefore, the United States of America targeted Iran's nuclear facilities such as Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan. These sites, long been associated with Iran's most sensitive programs, become the US targets. This message is unmistakable. Containment is no longer enough, and Iran responds immediately. Ballistic missiles strike the US bases across Iraq and Syria, marking one of the most sustained direct exchanges between the two nations in decades. What follows is not a single escalation, but a pattern. A strike is answered, a response invites another, and the rhythm of confrontation begins to take hold. Measured, deliberate, but increasingly difficult to control. As this conflict unfolds, it becomes increasingly difficult for it to be contained. The two parties, now aware what lies ahead of them, start to equip and conduct the military drills in the Gulf. The United States of America reinforces its presence across the Gulf, deploying aircraft carriers, advanced fighter jets, and missile defense systems. This region becomes saturated with military power. Iran, on the other hand, expands its military posture across the Gulf. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps conduct large-scale exercises, and they unveil new missile capabilities, and they strengthen coordination with allied groups across Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. The Middle East transforms from a global center of oil into a strategic chessboard where every move carries consequences far beyond the immediate target. What was once a bilateral rivalry is now a regional equation, complex, volatile, and increasingly unpredictable. In the opening months of 2026, this conflict that has been taking shape for many decades reached a dangerous phase. The United States of America, alongside its ally in Middle East, Israel, launched Operation Epic Fury. This operation targeted Iran's nuclear facilities and its nuclear infrastructure and the missile systems. This operation also targeted the regional networks that are tied to Iran's strategy in the Middle East. These strikes over the days became broader, deeper, and more intense. At the onset of these strikes, Iran showed its willingness to come back to the table of negotiation, but with only one condition: that the United States of America stops all the attacks against Tehran. This request is not granted, and as a result of that, the conflict becomes more intense. And with that, the final barrier of escalation between two states that have existed as bitter rivals takes shape. Iran chooses to retaliate and launches missile attacks and drone attacks against the US interests in the Middle East. Iran targets the US bases in Middle East in the states that are allied to the United States strategy in Middle East. This means that Iran escalates this conflict beyond its immediate parties to now including other states within the Middle East. And this means that Iran escalates this into a regional conflict where several states are drawn into this conflict. As this conflict continues forward, step by step and strike by strike, the window of diplomacy is finally shattered. With the window of diplomacy closing and finally shutting down completely, it means that this conflict can only escalate. In the weeks that have followed, the air raids have intensified and the missiles are now ruling the skies of the Middle East. The proxy forces, such as Hezbollah, that are pro-Iranian, have also been drawn into this conflict. And therefore, this is no longer a controlled exchange, but a signal of a larger looming war as far as this region is concerned. What began as years of rivalry is finally unfolding as a full-blown war, and this war is dragging the entire region into an intense conflict that has been brewing for years. And this conflict, which is defined by decades of rivalry, mistrust, and missed opportunities, finally engulfs the entire region of the Middle East. But beneath this conflict, where both parties are willing to escalate, and where the region is already on the brink of collapse, one question still remains. And that is, with the diminishing marginal error, and with the two parties keen to enhance their military campaigns against each other in the Middle East, where does the world stand in this conflict? The oil markets have surged. The humanitarian cost is increasing. And the global tension are taking shapes. And because of that, it means that this conflict, if not well negotiated out, risks plunging the world into a wider conflict. And therefore, the next move may not be measured, and it may not be controlled. And when it comes, it may change everything.